It is often said that possession is 9/10 of the law, but in the spring of 1933, in the land of the free, possession became a felony. We are taught that property rights are sacred, that what you earn, what you save, and what you hold in your hand belongs to you. It is the bedrock of the American experiment. But there was a moment in history, a specific date on the calendar, when that bedrock cracked. It wasn't an invasion by a foreign power. It wasn't a coup by a violent militia. It was a signature, a stroke of a pen on a piece of parchment that turned millions of law-abiding citizens into criminals overnight. This is not a story about economics. This is a forensic investigation into a heist. But unlike any heist you have seen in the cinema, the men taking the gold didn't wear masks. They didn't break into the vault at midnight. They owned the vault, and they demanded you hand over the combination. To understand how the United States government confiscated the wealth of its own people, we must first understand the atmosphere of the crime scene. The year is 1933. The Great Depression is not just a headline, it is a physical weight pressing down on the chest of the nation. The American financial system is undergoing a cardiac arrest. The patient is dying on the table, but the cause of death isn't just a lack of money, it is a lack of trust. You see, money is a faith-based system. It works only as long as we believe that the piece of paper in our pocket is worth something. In 1933, that faith had evaporated. Imagine the scene. It is February. The winter wind is cutting through the coats of the men and women standing in line. This queue isn't for bread. It isn't for work. It is for the teller's window. These people have smelled smoke. They know the building is burning, and they know there is only one exit. They didn't want paper. Paper was a promise. In 1933, promises were being broken by the hour. Banks were collapsing. 4,000 of them had already failed. When a bank failed in the 1930s, your money didn't just go into limbo, it vanished, vaporized. There was no insurance, no safety net. If the doors locked while your money was inside, you were destitute. So the American people did the only rational thing. They ran. They withdrew their savings. And they didn't just put the paper under their mattresses. They demanded redemption. You see, the US dollar was not fiat currency then. It was a gold certificate. It said, right on the face of the bill, that it was redeemable in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. This was the contract. The deal. You hold the paper for convenience, but the gold is the reality. The paper is the receipt. The gold is the asset. But in the early months of 1933, the public decided they wanted the asset. They were trading in their receipts. They were taking the physical metal out of the banking system and hiding it. In coffee cans buried in the garden, in floor safes, in hollowed-out books. The Treasury called it hoarding, a loaded word. Hoarding implies selfishness. It implies you are keeping something from the community. But from a forensic perspective, it was simply self-preservation. It was a flight to safety. But for the government, this was a catastrophe. Here is the mechanism that triggered the heist. Under the gold standard, the Federal Reserve could only print money if it had the gold to back it. For every dollar of gold in the vault, they could lend out roughly $2.50 in paper. It was a leash, a constraint. The gold kept the government honest. It prevented them from printing into infinity. But as the people pulled their gold out of the banks, the base of that pyramid shrank. For every ounce of gold that left the vault and went into a private safety deposit box, the Federal Reserve was forced to contract the money supply. They had to call in loans. They had to tighten credit. This is the deflationary death spiral. The more people panicked, the more gold they took. The more gold they took, the less money the banks could lend. The less they lent, the more businesses failed. The more businesses failed, the more people panicked. The economy was eating itself alive. And the men in Washington looked at this spiral and they realized something terrifying. They were losing control. They couldn't print their way out of the Depression because the gold handcuffs were too tight. And the key to those handcuffs was sitting in the pockets, purses, and private vaults of the American citizenry. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. March 4th, 1933. The day he took the oath of office, the financial heart of America had effectively stopped beating. By that morning, the governors of New York and Illinois had already suspended banking operations. The machinery was frozen. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A beautiful line. Rhetoric designed to calm a fevered nation. But behind the scenes, fear was exactly what the administration was using as a tool. They needed a way to stop the bleeding. They needed to stop the gold from leaving the system. They didn't wait. They couldn't wait. Within 24 hours of taking power, using a statute from World War I, the Trading with the Enemy Act, FDR declared a national banking holiday. A holiday. It sounds pleasant, doesn't it? A day off, a respite. In forensic terms, we call this a freeze, a lockdown. Every bank in the country was ordered to close its doors. No withdrawals, no transfers. And certainly, absolutely, no redemption of gold. This was the first step of the heist. You cannot rob a house if the residents are free to move their valuables. First, you must lock the doors. You must trap the assets inside. By closing the banks, the administration froze the gold that was still in the system. If you had gold in a vault at your local bank, it was no longer yours to touch. It was in purgatory. But what about the gold that was already out? What about the coins under the floorboards? What about the bullion in the private safety deposit boxes? That was the harder target. The government couldn't just lock a door to get that. They had to come for it. They had to make you bring it to them. For a month, the tension built. Rumors swirled. Was the gold standard ending? Would the dollar be devalued? And then, on April 5th, 1933, the hammer dropped. Executive Order 6102. I want you to listen to the language used here. This is not a request. It is not a suggestion for patriotic duty. It is a command. Prohibit hoarding. The order required all persons, meaning you, me, corporations, partnerships, to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. You had less than a month. And here's the kicker. Here's the forensic detail that turns this from a policy shift into a shakedown. The price. The government ordered you to hand in your gold, and in exchange, they would give you paper money. The rate was set at $20.67 per ounce. $20.67. That was the official price of gold. It had been the price for decades. On the surface, it seemed fair. A dollar for dollar swap. You give us the metal, we give you the currency. No harm, no foul, right? Wrong. Because everyone knew, the bankers, the politicians, and the savvy investors, that the dollar was overvalued. They knew the paper was going to be devalued. By forcing you to sell your gold at $20.67, the government was buying your assets at the bottom of the market, right before they planned to rig the price to go up. It's what we call insider trading today. But when the government does it, it's called monetary policy. But how do you enforce this? How do you make a free people surrender their wealth? You use the ultimate weapon, fear of the cage. Section 9, the teeth of the order. Whoever willfully violates any provision of this executive order shall be fined not more than $10,000 or imprisoned not more than 10 years, or both. Let's contextualize that. In 1933, the average annual salary was roughly $1,300. A $10,000 fine was a life sentence of debt. It was the equivalent of nearly $250,000 today. And 10 years in federal prison for the crime of owning sound money, for the crime of keeping the very asset the government had promised to honor just weeks prior. The threat worked. It sent a shockwave of terror through the population. The lines at the Federal Reserve banks grew long again. But this time, people weren't taking money out. They were putting it back in. It was a reverse bank run, a run into paper. People were terrified of their neighbors snitching. They were terrified of federal agents knocking on their doors. The land of the free had become a place where you looked at your floorboards and wondered if they were thick enough to hide a felony. However, like all great legal heists, there were exceptions. The government didn't want all the gold, they just wanted money. Gold customarily used in industry, profession, or art was exempt. Your wedding ring was safe, your gold tooth was safe. The government wasn't going to pry the fillings out of your mouth, not yet anyway. And there was another exemption. Gold coins having a recognized special value to collectors. This was the lifeline for the wealthy. If you could prove your gold coins were rare, you could keep them. Who decides what is rare? It was a gray area, a loophole for those with expensive lawyers. But for the average worker who had saved a few standard double eagles for a rainy day, there was no loophole. There was only the deadline. May 1st came and went. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold flowed into the treasury. The vaults of the Federal Reserve began to fill up with the confiscated wealth of the nation. The government had successfully nationalized the monetary standard. They had gathered the chips. But here is where the story turns from a seizure into a swindle. If the government had simply taken the gold and kept the price at $20.67, it would have been a violation of liberty, yes, but financially neutral. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was never to just hold the gold. The plan was to reprice it, to change the definition of the dollar itself. The government had just forced you to sell your car for $500 under threat of prison, knowing full well that next week they were going to declare the car worth $1,000. They cleared the board. They eliminated the competition. And now that they held all the cards, they were getting ready to change the rules of the game. The autopsy of the 1933 gold heist reveals a premeditated strategy to devalue the currency and transfer purchasing power from the saver to the state. By late May 1933, the operation was largely complete. The private gold of the American citizenry had been harvested. It had moved from the socks and safes of Main Street to the deep storage vaults of the Federal Reserve. The American people were now holding paper dollars. They had obeyed the law. They had turned in their asset for $20.67 an ounce. They believed the crisis was over. They believed the government had taken the gold to protect the currency. But they were about to learn a hard lesson in forensic economics. You don't confiscate an asset to protect its price. You confiscate it to change it. Imagine a game of poker where one player forces everyone else to fold their hands, collects all the chips, and then declares that each chip is now worth double. That is what was about to happen. While the public was distracted by the drama of the bank holiday and the gold turn-in, Congress was busy passing a piece of legislation attached to a farm bill. It was called the Thomas Amendment. To the average farmer, it looked like relief. To a forensic accountant, it looked like a loaded gun pointed at the dollar. This amendment gave the president the unilateral power to reduce the gold content of the dollar by up to 50%. Think about that. The Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. But here, Congress handed that power to one man. They gave him the keys to the printing press and the authority to redefine reality. In the summer and autumn of 1933, the administration began an experiment that sounds like conspiracy fiction, but is a matter of historical record. It was called the Gold Buying Program. Every morning, Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, would go to the president's bedroom. FDR would be eating his eggs in bed, and together these two men would decide the price of gold for the day. Not the market, not supply and demand, just two men in pajamas, guessing. One famous morning, FDR decided to raise the price of gold by 21 cents. Why? Because he said it was a lucky number, 3 times 7. Let that sink in. The value of the currency used by millions of people, the savings of a lifetime, the wages of a nation, was being manipulated based on numerology and whimsy over morning coffee. This wasn't economics. It was alchemy. Day by day, they bid up the price of gold. They offered more paper dollars for every ounce. This had a specific effect. It devalued the paper dollar. If it takes more dollars to buy an ounce of gold, then each dollar is worth less. It was a stealth inflation, a deliberate destruction of the currency's purchasing power. Finally, on January 30th, 1934, the game ended. The Gold Reserve Act was passed. The government officially nationalized all the gold it had seized. The title transferred from the Federal Reserve to the U.S. Treasury. And the next day, FDR issued a proclamation. He set the new official price of gold at 35 points or an ounce. Do the math. The government forced you to sell your gold to them for $20.67. 9 months later, they declared that same gold, not the gold sitting in their vault, which used to be your gold, was worth $35. That is a markup of 69%. Where did that profit go? The U.S. Treasury booked a profit of $2.8 billion. In 1934, that was an astronomical sum. It was enough to fund the New Deal programs for years. It was the largest transfer of wealth in American history up to that point. And it was done without a single tax being voted on. It was a tax on savings, a tax on prudence. The saver who obeyed the law lost 40% of their purchasing power instantly. The dollar in their pocket could buy 40% less gold than it could the year before. The government had effectively stolen 40 cents of every dollar in existence, not by taking the paper, but by draining the value out of it. But the heist had one more loose end: the contracts. You see, Americans weren't stupid. They knew politicians liked to print money. So for decades, they had protected themselves with something called a gold clause. Millions of private contracts, mortgages, corporate bonds, even government bonds, had this clause. It stated that the debt must be paid in gold coin, or in dollars equivalent to the original weight of gold. It was an insurance policy against exactly what FDR was doing. If you owed $10,000 on a mortgage with a gold clause, and the dollar was devalued by 40%, you would legally owe $16,900 in the new paper money. The creditors, the banks, the bondholders, expected to be made whole. They expected the contract to be honored. The government looked at this mountain of debt, public and private, and realized that if the gold clauses were enforced, the devaluation would bankrupt the debtors. And the biggest debtor of all? The United States government. So, on June 5th, 1933, Congress passed a resolution that simply canceled them. All of them. Retroactively. They declared that requiring payment in gold was against public policy. They nullified the gold clauses in every single contract, past, present, and future. Even the contracts written on the Liberty bonds that patriotic citizens had bought to fund World War I. This was the death of the contract. The government told its own creditors, "We promised to pay you in gold. We lied. Here's paper. Take it or leave it." It was a default, plain and simple, but because it was done by the sovereign, it wasn't called bankruptcy. It was called reform. Surely, you say, this is illegal. The Constitution forbids the impairment of contracts. The Fifth Amendment forbids the taking of private property without just compensation. The people sued. The cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1935, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The nation held its breath. If the court ruled against the government, the dollar would collapse. The debt would explode. FDR was reportedly preparing a radio address to tell the public he would ignore the court if they ruled against him. The ruling was 5-4. By a single vote, the Supreme Court upheld the government's actions. Justice James McReynolds, one of the dissenters, was so disgusted he refused to read his written opinion. He leaned into his microphone and extemporized, his voice trembling with rage. He said, "The Constitution is gone." He said, "This is Nero at his worst." He saw what had happened. The highest court in the land had just validated the theft. They had ruled that the government's need to manage the economy outweighed the individual's right to their property. The precedent was cemented. Money was no longer a property right. It was a privilege granted by the state, revocable at will. By 1935, the United States government had a problem, a physical problem. They had successfully seized the private wealth of the nation. They had melted down millions of coins, the savings of farmers, shopkeepers, and widows, into generic 400-ounce bars. They had the loot, but they had nowhere to put it. The vaults in New York and Philadelphia were overflowing. But more importantly, they were vulnerable. The military looked at the coastlines and saw targets. If an enemy fleet attacked New York, the gold was at risk. They needed a location that was geographically impossible to invade. They needed a fortress behind the Appalachian Mountains. They chose a site in Kentucky, far from the sea, surrounded by Army bases. They called it the United States Bullion Depository. You know it as Fort Knox. Forensically speaking, Fort Knox is not a bank. A bank is designed to facilitate the movement of money. Fort Knox was designed to stop it. It is a tomb, a granite and concrete sarcophagus built to hold the corpse of the gold standard. The walls are lined with granite. The door weighs 20 tons. No single person knows the full combination. It is bomb-proof, torch-proof, and drill-proof. Why? To keep thieves out? Perhaps. But primarily to keep the gold in, to remove it from the economy so completely that it becomes a myth. In 1937, the shipment began. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. 500 train cars, protected by the 7th Cavalry Brigade, the same unit that rode with Custer, now riding shotgun on the nation's confiscated savings. They moved nearly 147 million ounces of gold. At today's prices, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. But back then, it was simply the reserve. They stacked the bars in the vault, floor to ceiling, sealed the doors, and posted the guards. And there it sat. The gold that had once circulated in the pockets of citizens, buying bread and milk and land, was now locked in the dark, thousands of miles away from the people who earned it. It had been sterilized. This brings us to a critical concept in our investigation. Sterilization. In economics, when you bury an asset so it cannot affect the money supply, you sterilize it. The gold in Fort Knox was no longer money. It was a prisoner. The US dollar was still technically backed by gold, but only for foreign governments. For the American citizen, the dollar was now a fiat note, backed only by the government's promise to pay. This allowed the government to print, and print they did, to fund the New Deal, to fund the preparations for World War II. They expanded the money supply massively, unconstrained by the need to have physical gold in your pocket. The golden fetters were gone for them, but the chains remained on you. The transformation was subtle. The paper in your wallet looked the same, but the contract had changed. It was no longer a claim check for gold. It was a claim check for nothing. It was legal tender, yes, but it had no final redemption. Fast forward to 1944. The world is in flames. Europe is destroyed. Asia is burning. But in a quiet hotel in New Hampshire, the United States is about to play the ace card it had been hiding in Fort Knox. This was the Bretton Woods Conference. The goal? To design the post-war financial world. The British, led by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, wanted a neutral global currency, a fair system. But the Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, said no. They laid their cards on the table, and their hand was unbeatable. Because of the war, and because of the 1933 confiscation, the United States held nearly 75% of the world's investable gold. They owned the casino, so they set the rules. Here was the deal they forced on the world. All currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Do you see the genius of the heist? First, they took the gold from their own citizens to secure the domestic system. Then, they used that same pile of stolen gold to back the dollar, making it the world reserve currency. They leveraged the confiscated wealth of the American shopkeeper to buy the loyalty of the world. The US dollar became as good as gold. Central banks around the world started stockpiling dollars instead of gold because they trusted the US promise. They trusted that if they ever wanted to, they could take those dollars to the gold window at the Treasury and get the metal back. For a while it worked. The system seemed stable. The US was the economic engine of the world. The dollar was king. But forensic accounting teaches us that every Ponzi scheme has a fatal flaw. The flaw in Bretton Woods was simple math. The U.S. was printing dollars to send overseas, to fund the Marshall Plan, to build bases in Germany and Japan, to fight the Korean War. More and more paper dollars were leaving American shores. As long as the foreign nations kept the dollars, everything was fine. But what if they asked for the gold? The U.S. had promised to redeem dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. But by the late 1950s, there were more paper claims on gold than there was gold in the vault. It is the same mechanism as a bank run, but on a planetary scale. The American citizens had been banned from redeeming gold. That was illegal since 1933. But foreign governments were allowed to do it. The gold window was open to them. Enter the whistleblowers. Or, as the U.S. government saw them, the troublemakers. European nations, particularly France, started to do the math. They looked at the mountain of dollars the U.S. was printing to fund its wars and its welfare state, and they looked at the gold in Fort Knox. They realized the numbers didn't add up. So they started to call the bluff. In the early 1960s, planes and ships started arriving in New York. They brought pallets of paper dollars. They demanded the metal. The gold started to flow out. The reserve that had been seized from the American people in 1933 was now bleeding away to foreign capitals. The heist was unraveling. The U.S. government panicked. If the world realized they were running out of gold, the dollar would collapse. So they formed a cartel, a secret conspiracy known as the London Gold Pool. The plan was simple: manipulate the price. If the price of gold started to rise above $35 in the free market, these nations agreed to sell their own gold reserves to flood the market and drive the price back down. They were suppressing the fever to hide the infection. They were burning the family furniture to keep the house warm. For 7 years, they dumped thousands of tons of gold into the market to keep the price at $35. They were trying to defy the laws of supply and demand, but you cannot suppress reality forever. In 1968, the London Gold Pool collapsed. The vault in Fort Knox, once overflowing with the plunder of 1933, was now dangerously light. By the summer of 1971, the United States was bleeding to death, financially speaking. The gold window, that metaphysical counter at the Treasury where foreign nations could trade their paper dollars for American gold, was overwhelmed. The British ambassador showed up at the Treasury asking for $3 billion in gold. The French were sending warships to collect their bullion. The Swiss, the Germans, the Japanese, they all saw the writing on the wall. They knew the U.S. had printed more paper claims than it had metal to back them. It was a classic bank run, but the depositors were nuclear powers. President Richard Nixon faced a binary choice. Option A: adhere to the Bretton Woods Agreement. This would mean stopping the printing press, slashing government spending, inducing a massive depression to strengthen the dollar, and essentially admitting the U.S. was broke. Option B: change the rules. Default: break the promise that had held the global economy together since 1944. Treasury Secretary John Connolly famously told the Europeans, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." That was the attitude. They weren't going to save the system. They were going to save themselves. On Friday, August 13th, 1971, Nixon summoned his top economic team to Camp David. It was a secret meeting. He told the press it was just a weekend getaway. But inside the lodge, they were plotting the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. They worked through the weekend. They knew that if word leaked out, the markets would crash before they could even make the announcement. They had to act before the Asian markets opened on Monday morning. They were writing the eulogy for the gold standard. Sunday night, prime time. Most Americans were watching Bonanza. Suddenly, the show was interrupted. The President of the United States appeared on every channel. I want you to listen closely to the forensic language of political deception. He didn't say default. He didn't say bankruptcy. Suspend temporarily. Those two words are the greatest lie in modern economic history. Temporary. Like the income tax was temporary. Like the bank holiday was temporary. It has been over 50 years. That temporary suspension is still in effect. In that moment, with a single sentence, Nixon severed the final link between the dollar and the physical world. The anchor was cut. The ship was now adrift in a sea of pure paper. This was the birth of the modern fiat currency system. Fiat is Latin for "let it be done." It means the money has value simply because the government says it has value, not because it is redeemable for anything. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The dollar plunged on foreign exchange markets. Inflation in the U.S. exploded. The price of oil quadrupled. Why? Because the discipline was gone. Before 1971, if the government printed too much money, gold flowed out of the country. It was a painful physical alarm system. After 1971, there was no alarm. If the government needed money, they just printed it. Deficits didn't matter anymore. Debt didn't matter anymore. Look at this chart. This is the forensic smoking gun. The moment the gold window closed, the debt ceiling became a floor. The US government began a borrowing binge that has never ended. They essentially wrote a blank check on the future labor of the American taxpayer. But how does this affect you? The citizen? The victim of the heist? It affects you through the silent theft, the invisible tax. When the currency is unmoored from reality, the government can print purchasing power away from your savings and into their accounts. It shows up as inflation. You think prices are going up, but forensically, that is incorrect. Prices aren't going up. The value of your money is going down. In 1971, gold was $35 an ounce. Today, it is over $2,000 an ounce. Did gold become 60 times more valuable? Did gold become more efficient, more delicious? No, gold is a rock. It sits there. It does nothing. The gold didn't change. The measuring stick shrank. The dollar lost 98% of its purchasing power relative to the only asset that cannot be printed. That is the theft. That is the 6102 heist playing out in slow motion every single day for 50 years. If a private corporation did what the US government did, the CEO would be in prison for fraud. Imagine a warehouse that issues receipts for gold. Then, one day, the warehouse manager says, "We are keeping the gold, but you can keep the receipts. And by the way, we are going to print 1 trillion more receipts." That is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. But because it is the state, it is called monetary policy. It is legal. It is celebrated. Economists write textbooks about how brilliant it is, and it continues. In 2008, they printed trillions. In 2020, they printed trillions more. Why? Because they can. Because the golden handcuffs of 1933 were cut off in 1971, there is no restraint left. Let us conclude our forensic investigation, the case of the people versus the state. Exhibit A, the seizure. The government criminalized the ownership of the only asset that they could not print. Exhibit B, the sterilization. They locked that asset away to ensure that paper money had no competition. Exhibit C, the default. They broke the promise to redeem the paper, turning the currency into a floating abstraction. The result? We live in a financial matrix, a hallucination of wealth built on debt that can never be repaid. The money in your bank account is not an asset. It is a liability of a bankrupt institution. But this remembers. Gold is the memory of the market. It remembers 1933. It remembers 1971. It is the only asset that has no counterparty risk. It is the only asset that is not someone else's promise. History teaches us that all paper currencies eventually return to their intrinsic value. 0. The timeline may be long, but the trajectory is always the same. The heist of 1933 wasn't just a moment in history. It was the beginning of a process that is still extracting wealth from your pocket today. The question is not, will it happen again? The forensic evidence shows it is happening right now. The only question is, do you hold the paper or do you hold the rock?